Hello everyone. In this video I explain the meta in Guild Wars 2 player versus environment. I do not want to make this a build specific video because popular builds are merely a reflection of what currently produces the highest damage numbers. I'm more interested in presenting the underlying logic of current group and squad compositions in fractals, raids and strikes. So let us talk about boons. Guild Wars 2, more than ever before in the game's long history, has a meta defined by two boons, quickness and alacrity. Quickness is a boon that speeds up the abilities your character uses. If you have quickness, it means you can put everything you have on cooldown faster. This has two advantages. The cooldowns of your skills refresh sooner because they were started sooner. This is mostly felt on skills with short cooldowns and long cast times. And secondly, you have more downtime between skill casts, which allows you to use more auto hits in between. All those extra auto hits are free damage, and the stronger your build's auto hits are, the more important quickness is going to be for your damage. Alacrity improves the recharge rate of your skills. If you have alacrity permanently, a skill that has a 10 seconds cooldown will recharge in only 8 seconds. Having alacrity has three main advantages. It directly translates into more skill casts of your most powerful skills. This is most impactful with skills of low cast time and long cooldowns. Because you have alacrity, you need to do fewer auto attacks in between skill casts and can fill time instead only with the most impactful actions. The weaker your build's auto hits are, the more important alacrity is going to be. And thirdly, alacrity reduces the recharge on skills that give boons. This reduces the boon duration required to play boon support builds, which is a significant damage increase. In summary, quickness means you get to do more auto attacks in between skill casts because you run out of skills to cast sooner, and alacrity then removes some of those auto attacks because the skill cooldowns are reduced as well. So weirdly enough, a build with neither boon may end up playing similarly to a build with both boons, and very distinctly to a build that only has either quickness or alacrity. Ultimately, both boons are very important to have for optimal damage output in a group. When building a group of 5 players, in order to make boon generation more structured, the community has decided it makes sense to specialize. There are so-called quickness builds, whose job it is to provide 100% of quickness uptime for the entire party. On the other hand, there are so-called alacrity builds, whose job it is to produce 100% of alacrity uptime for the entire party. As of the making of this video, there is currently no build that can produce both boons in sufficient quantity, which means that we need one quickness build and one alacrity build. Together, these two builds are the boon supports of the party. They are complemented by 3 pure DPS builds. Because there is a general expectation that a boon support will provide 100% of its respective boon, a pure DPS build is never supposed to produce one of those boons. While there are some DPS builds that can very reasonably give a little bit of boon uptime to fill in some small gaps, under no circumstances should they try to double up on the boon production, as it is simply a waste of personal damage output to do so. Now that we have covered the two most important meta-defining boons, you are essentially ready to already understand everything that's going on in group content. When a good commander makes subgroups in the Dragon's End meta event, they will put a quickness and an alacrity provider into each subgroup of his 50-player squad. That's all there is to it, really. If you want to run a strike squad of 10 players, make sure to follow this same concept. Make 2 subgroups of 5 players each, with one alacrity producer and one quickness producer in each subgroup. However, the discussion doesn't quite end there. There are a lot of equally, if not more important boons, and we have not talked about healers yet either. So first, there's Fury. Fury gives 25% critical hit chance in player versus environment. This is a very important boon to have. However, nowadays it is generated almost automatically just by attacking enemies. If you are in a rare situation where you're not getting enough Fury, there's very likely a simple solution to it when just one player changes a trait or a skill. Secondly, there's Might. Might is a very strong boon that greatly buffs your power and condition damage. It stacks in intensity up to 25 times, and having 25 stacks of Might is mathematically conveniently roughly worth 25% extra damage output. However, the issue is that there are not actually that many builds which produce 25 might straight up. And you definitely don't want to be in a situation where your group is lacking this powerful boon. In order to improve reliability, the Guild Wars 2 community has sort of agreed that the quickness and alacrity producers are kind of in charge of bringing this boon. However, not every boon support is equally effective at it. For example, while a power alacrity mechanist can reliably produce 25 stacks of might on its own, a quickness chronomancer will provide very little. Similarly, an alacrity willbender produces nearly no might. On the other hand, a quickness herald does easily more than 15 stacks of might. Though might is a boon that cannot clearly be attributed to either the quickness or the alacrity support. This is in parts a reason why groups generally favor boon supports that can provide at least a good amount of might. It greatly increases the flexibility of a group composition. An alacrity willbender and a quickness chronomancer together are going to be a very bad match, whereas a quickness herald or an alacrity mechanist can be paired with nearly any other boon support. So, can you never play a boon support that has low might output? No, there's another way out of this problem. You see, so far we only talked about doing damage, but in a lot of content you also need to be prepared to take some damage. In high-level fractals, in strike missions and in raids, groups often like to bring healers. The standard setup would be to bring one healer per 5 players, so 2 healers in a 10-player strike squad. A healer's main purpose is to keep the squad alive. For that, they sacrifice their entire damage output. But now that they are not doing damage, they might as well double up as boon supports. All the most popular healers in Guild Wars 2 provide either quickness or alacrity. Since they are not concerned with dealing damage, they can also go for maximum boon sharing capabilities. It is standard for a healer to provide the defensive boons protection, regeneration and swiftness. The best healers will also often bring stability or aegis for increased safety. But crucially, most healers build towards significant might sharing. Alacrity heal druids, for instance, produce 25 might very easily. Might production has become an expectation we have towards healers. This is quite an unfortunate reality for lesser known heal builds like Heal Renegade or Heal Scrapper, who may struggle to have perfect might coverage. This does not mean heal builds that lack some might cannot be played at all, but they require more care when building a team composition, since they don't bring a boon many would expect from them. A pairing of Heal Scrapper and Alacrity Willbender, for example, would require major build adaptations. So, in summary, the meta team composition at the moment is 3 DPS players who do not concern themselves with producing boons, 1 boon support, either quickness or alacrity, who produces 100% uptime of its boon and then maximizes its damage output beyond that. Producing might is an advantage here, but not 100% necessary. And finally, 1 boon support for the other boon that is still missing, who also doubles up as a healer and produces defensive boons and as much might as possible. And that's already it basically. Now you understand the core of the boon meta and you're ready to run your own squads for strike missions. But hang on for a second. This would not really be one of my videos if I was happy to only address complete newcomers to group content. I also like to expand topics a bit to make them more interesting to think about for more experienced players. From now on, I'll assume that you're familiar with the basics of group content, so apologies to the beginners I lose in the following section. So let's first talk about solo healing. In 10-man content, going from 2 healers to just 1 healer is the easiest way to gain a ton of extra group DPS. When you think about it, you turn 1 quickness healer or alacrity healer into a extra quickness DPS or alacrity DPS respectively. This will be worth upwards of 20,000 extra DPS, just like that. But remember how we offloaded a lot of boon responsibilities, in particular defensive boons but also might, onto the heal support in the meta composition before? This now causes issues for the subgroup without a healer. Now it is crucial that the quickness and alacrity builds you are running produce might, and also protection, regeneration and swiftness become very important assets to a offensive boon support. On the current patch, builds like Power Quickness Herald and Power Alacrity Mechanist are extremely well suited for these solo healing scenarios because they tick quite a few of those boxes. A solo healing composition would put a healer and a boon support in one group and then, for example, a quickness herald in the group without the healer, so it can produce its protection and might in that group. Similar challenges become apparent when playing fractals without a healer. If you are planning to do fractal challenge modes without a dedicated healer, make sure you have a very good plan on how to produce might. It is also possible to, in parts, rely on DPS builds providing some complementary might, but generally this makes it very complicated to build. Having solid knowledge of all currently popular builds is an invaluable skill once you start pushing into more advanced territory with these slightly more non-standard team compositions. Next up, we're going to challenge the premise of this video. Right at the start, I said that quickness and alacrity are very important. Did you ever question whether that is actually true, or if it's just repeated after players who are more well known than you are and who are perceived to know better? So let's think about it for a second. Undoubtedly, both alacrity and quickness provide some huge advantages, but they also come at a cost. For example, a healer does almost no damage whatsoever, whereas a DPS player could do up to 40k DPS. Imagine the following composition. You have one quickness healer, one alacrity DPS, and 3 DPS players. Let us imagine for a second that not having quickness costs a DPS player roughly 8k DPS, and it costs the alacrity DPS 5000 DPS. Then this quickness healer is basically a zero-sum game if you think about it. Your group of 5 would do the same amount of damage with 4 DPS players and 1 alacrity DPS, but no quickness source. Obviously there are 2 faults to this argument. On the one hand, the healer has also lots of other responsibilities like healing, providing defensive boons, and might. On the other hand, if you decided that a healer is not relevant because we are good enough to avoid all damage that is dealt to us, then we could still run a damage-oriented quickness support to make it worth it, right? So the comparison between a healer who does no damage and a full DPS player without the boon is not exactly a fair comparison between boon supports and DPS. It is rather a comparison between healer and DPS. However, this idea is not just an academic exercise, it teaches us a few things. First and foremost, it teaches us that it's very important for a boon support who is boon DPS support to actually do significantly more damage than a healer would do. As a boon support, your damage output matters a lot to justify your slot in the group. Unlike the healer, you are usually not providing extra safety or any defensive boons, so the boon you generate must make up for the damage difference between you and the DPS players. This is part of the reason why damage-oriented boon supports don't just play 100% boon duration all the time. And this ruthless calculation might be harsher than you think. On the one hand, there are DPS builds that can provide partial uptime of quickness or alacrity. For example, you can run 2 Condition Renegade builds with a certain setup to do nearly full DPS while joining forces to provide 100% alacrity, completely rationalizing away the need for a dedicated alacrity provider. So as a dedicated alacrity DPS build, there's actually some pressure from above to do enough damage to be worth it. On the other hand, especially alacrity is not actually self-serving. As an example, in speedrunning scenarios, one can sometimes come to the conclusion that the DPS classes are so much better than an alacrity support would be that the boon is dropped altogether. You can see this in the gameplay footage displayed in the background. We realized that given our typical phase durations, alacrity would not let us actually cast our most important skills more often, so running a alacrity support would not really make sense there. As a result, we decided that playing an additional DPS class is just favorable overall. Finally, not every DPS class relies strongly on having boons. For example, a conditioned Daredevil spends a large amount of its time in dagger 3 animations and dodge animations. Both are not sped up by the quickness boon. As a result, lower quickness uptime will only cost some auto attacks. Similarly, a Power Deadeye might lose only around 2k DPS by not having alacrity, because the build does not have many relevant cooldowns in the first place. All of those considerations are then amplified when you do content in groups of 3 or groups of 2. Running boon supports just for the sake of having them is often not the correct play in a 2-player group, for example. That being said, in general, it is unlikely that you are ever going to find yourself in a scenario where the strategic choice is made to forgo those boons. The vast majority of players play endgame content in groups of 5 or groups of 10 with safe compositions, including healers and all the boons in the game. Nevertheless, it helps to remember and always question why the boon meta in Guild Wars 2 is the way it is. Thinking about these issues lays the foundation to becoming a good group leader. Thanks for watching.